It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. When the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2015 that marriage between any two loving adults is a constitutional right, regardless of their gender, it seemed America had inexplicably undergone one of the most sudden and dramatic changes ever in the values of our citizens and legal interpretation by our highest courts. Barely 5 years earlier, President Barack Obama was on record that marriage could only be legally defined in the most traditional way, as a relationship between one man and one woman. The Republican nominee he defeated in 2012, Mitt Romney, said the same thing and had led a campaign to reverse gay rights in Massachusetts. Hillary Clinton also seemed to agree that marriage couldn't be redefined. She said any change needed to occur state by state, driven by public opinion and local legislators, even though in 2011, California voters had passed Proposition 8, explicitly banning gay marriage after a political campaign fraught with cliched suggestions that gay couples were immoral or dangerous. Even in New York, the state Senate voted decisively to stop a new law authorizing gay marriage. So how did that sea change occur so quickly, and how real is it, especially in light of new developments such as the overwhelming rejection of an equal rights ordinance in Houston, Texas? Our guest today is one of the key organizers of a long effort that preceded this tidal shift in American thinking. Marc Solomon says it wasn't simply an inevitable outcome of America's natural moral trajectory toward becoming a diverse and more tolerant society, but was instead the result of a carefully planned campaign by an alliance of organizations like his own. He is the national campaign director for the group Freedom to Marry and the author of Winning Marriage, the inside story of how same-sex couples took on the politicians and pundits and won. Marc, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We've now passed through this tremendous change, this tremendous legal change, what seems to be a giant shift in the opinion of rank-and-file Americans. Something like 65%, right, of Americans are supportive in one way or another of gay marriage or equal marriage. A host of political figures, like the ones I was just naming, except Governor Romney, have changed dramatically their positions in terms of equal marriage. But if that wasn't the result of simply the evolution of American values toward this more progressive or inclusive sense of things, if that's not what this was, what was it?
It was a social movement. It was the result of, 15 years is one way to count it. Some say 30 plus years of telling our stories, organizing, sharing who we were, with the ultimate goal of getting the Supreme Court to rule our way. But I can promise you that if we'd gone to the Supreme Court 10 years ago or 5 years ago, they would not have ruled this way. And the Constitution hasn't changed. So it's really what people's understanding of who gay and lesbian people are and why gay and lesbian people want to marry that has changed.
I'm just fascinated by the political mechanics almost of this, but it was such a dramatic shift in terms of the outcomes on the ground. I was just looking back at some of the numbers that up until I think it was November 2012, the gay marriage equality acts and provisions of various types had been defeated at the ballot box 32 times. I think that's the number, 32 consecutive defeats. There had been 70 million votes cast against equal marriage measures and such. But then suddenly, this dramatic reversal, and there began to be both electoral victories and then the sequence of court decisions those dominoes did fall much faster than I think anybody was really anticipating. Even your organization had not expected that by 2015 we would be where we are. But so what was the fulcrum? What was the break point?
Until the political center of gravity hits a certain place, politicians, electeds are reluctant to take a stand. But once you get past 50%, 55%, and once you show that it's electorally viable, that you can run for re-election and still win and be in support, And once we showed, most importantly, once we showed what it really was all about, that when we won certain states and people saw same-sex couples who were married and met their families and their kids and saw that it really was about committed people getting married and not about all these other things that our opponents were trying to scare people with, they came on board.
Tell us the narrative of that to some degree. I mean,
Sure.
pick the right point in time.
Yeah.
But the gay rights movement essentially begins with the Stonewall Inn riot event of it's 1969, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so that's sort of the beginning of consciousness of this whole issue and activism. But so at what point does the movement toward winning marriage, as you define it, when does it really begin, and what are the key elements of
So
it?
I'd say the beginning of the fight for marriage in earnest was in Hawaii in the mid-1990s when same-sex couples filed a suit and they won for the first time. They won the Supreme Court said that they needed to apply heightened scrutiny. It went back to a trial, and then we won in a trial. Now that was knocked out through a constitutional amendment in Hawaii, and then the result of that was Congress passing the so-called Defense of Marriage Act, which overwhelmingly signed into law by President Clinton. So that was for our community, that was the first real sign that we could win, that we could make our case, and that people would take this seriously. So I got involved in the early 2000s in Massachusetts, and that was the first court case where we prevailed and same-sex couples were able to marry. But back then, I remember so clearly the day that we won. I was broadcasting live on TV on New England cable news, and they were reading me all these different responses. And the usual suspects were strongly against President Bush, Governor Romney, the Catholic hierarchy, but so were the Democrats in Massachusetts, including Senator John Kerry, who opposed the decision and supported a state constitutional amendment to take it away. So really, from that point on, we had to figure out how to build power, grow public support, make our case, show that this wasn't an electoral disaster for people who stood with us, and that's what we did from then on, and that's the campaign I've been involved in for the last, really the last 15 years.
Was there essentially an understanding between someone like you and others who were involved and figures like them did Senator Kerry, was he behind the scenes saying to you, look, it's not really what I think, but I have to take this position because that's the political requirements force me to do that, but really I'm on your side, and if you can do X, Y, and Z, this could all work out somehow? Mm-hmm. Or was your view that he really believed what he said?
I don't think he really believed what he said, but but there was no sort of wink, wink, nod, nod. I mean, he certainly wanted support from the gay community, and I co-hosted a fundraiser, so I knew he was better than, from our vantage point, than the alternative. It was, it was some pretty tough conversations with them about how harmful they were to our cause. But it's always a dance with elected officials, because there's really elected officials or people who are running for office, and he was running for president then, feel like there's a really narrow band, for political viability of a position. And what I realized, instead of just getting extremely angry at these people who are running, Hillary and Obama and Kerry, was that I realized that we needed to both push them, but also push the center of gravity on our issue, so that they felt, and their advisors would feel, like they wouldn't be committing political suicide by taking our position.
And so how did you do that? How did you change the grassroots dynamic?
Yeah, so the most important thing was winning states. And in America, we always had a strategy, what we call our roadmap to victory. We knew ultimately we'd need to win at the Supreme Court. But we also knew that the Supreme Court never acts first on major civil rights issues. We needed to build a critical mass of states and a critical mass of public support. So we went out and focused on winning states, and we went to states where we thought we had the best chance of winning. Holding the win in Massachusetts was extremely important. We had to fend off 2 constitutional amendments. We won some of the smaller New England states after then. We won Iowa, which was a big deal because it was in the heart of the country, and we were able to stave off constitutional amendments. And then we won in New York, which was a really big deal, passed it through a Republican-led state Senate. So showing people what this was really all about, and then organizing the couples who had gotten married and their families to share their stories and talk about who they really were and why this mattered, and connecting to straight folks about, we didn't want to, our opponents said we wanted to uproot marriage, we wanted to tear it apart, and what we wanted to show people is we didn't want to uproot it, we wanted to join it, we wanted to be a part of it, and this is who we are, this is who our family is.
It was always my perception that one of the problems around advancing gay rights was that most people were in the closet. I think that's true.
Yeah.
But then when they were out of the closet, it tended to be around events like Pride Day or Pride Week, things that lots of other folks reacted to the spectacle of some of those events very negatively. I mean, was there an active conversation about sort of that dilemma of which side do we present, or how do we present ourselves?
Well, there's certainly always a conversation about how you present your movement. Certainly when you're talking about television ads, and you're always making choices. But I think what was so important about the marriage movement is that it took many of those people you were talking about who were in the closet or who were living quietly, living in their communities, who didn't consider themselves political. But once they realized they had the opportunity to potentially get married, something that's really almost a rite of passage in our society, people came out of the woodwork, regular, ordinary folks, and were willing to, in small towns all over the country, people who were living with their heads down because they didn't know how their neighbors would react to their being out, came out and talked about who they were, talked to their neighbors, talked to their lawmakers. That made a huge difference in how Americans perceived our community. Now, I think there's nothing wrong with people who are part of pride parades and who celebrate in every way.
Exactly.
But I also think that, and I know this because I watched the focus groups, people had a real misperception in 2001, 2002, 2003, who our community was. Or like it's those people in New York and San Francisco, it's those people at pride parades. It's not the nice couple that lives down the block or the person I went to high school with, or my parents' buddy's son who just got married. So the marriage movement has really changed and given a much more, I think, accurate depiction of the, of who the LGBT community is.
But it also reminds me of there's a Gandhi quote that Dr. King was very quoted many times, was very interested in, and it made a big impression on me. But King would talk about that Gandhi said that nonviolent social change, social action only works when the oppressor loves the oppressed. Mm-hmm. That's when demonstrations have an effect. Is that when and I thought that in terms of issues around gay rights, that was the critical part of the coming out movement, was that it was so easy for straight people to be in denial about their cousin or their uncle or aunt or whoever, or the little lady down the street who just never married for some reason. Mm-hmm. You could be in total denial about that as long as people were in the closet. But once they began to be much more open about their lives, then you realize that, okay, this is about people that I already do love.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And the reason we didn't do we certainly did protests, but the core of our movement was sharing our stories. And what we found is that being out was crucial, but it wasn't enough anymore. We needed not only to be out as gay or lesbian people, we needed to talk about why marriage was important to us and talk about our relationships, talk about the integrity of our relationships. Ultimately, we were arguing for making the case for being included in marriage and for people recognizing the depth of our love. And that's not something that people get, that our audience would get through angry protests. We needed to make our strong case, but be extraordinarily persistent, and then play real hardball politics too, because we were working, we were fighting for something, that was hugely aspirational from our perspective, but we also had to fight it in Albany, New York, and Springfield, Illinois, that aren't always terribly aspirational places to do business. Yeah.
And I wondered at one time whether the solution might actually be a severance of the government from having anything to do with marriage, and there being and just letting that be a religious pursuit, and there being a separate thing of just some sort of a legal contract that the government oversees between any two people who want to come together.
Given the fact that the government was involved in marriage, and both with respect to conveying the respect and support and the literally more than 1,000 protections and benefits that come along with marriage, from birth to death with taxes in between. We knew that marriage was crucial. We already had a word and an institution to convey the ultimate relationship, and we didn't want to be seen as different, as asking for something different, because when an oppressed group asks for something different, it often becomes separate and not quite equal.
There's been another account of how this dramatic change came to pass that is a more lawyer-focused account. The suggestion seems to be more that actually by the time Proposition 8 passed in California, that the movement was kind of spent at that point, that that the strategy had not played out, and that there was discouragement among activists, and that it was then these brilliant lawyers who sort of picked up the mantle.
Well, I don't think it's accurate. I think that we were always a social movement. It took having 37 states and having 60+% of the population, and including every region of the country with majority support, for the court to look around and say, you know what, the country's going to be fine with this. And I think we've seen that be the case. Things have gone exceedingly smoothly. If this Kim Davis thing in Kentucky is the biggest flare-up, we're doing terrifically well.
And you're talking about the county clerk who refused on religious grounds to issue marriage licenses even after the Supreme Court ruling. Yeah.
Right, but when you think about it, in every county in Texas, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, clerks are providing marriage licenses. There's no uproar. There's no massive protest. America is good.
There is also some history of that there is a momentous Supreme Court decision like this one. We can, to stick to the civil rights comparisons, go back to the Brown v. Board decision in 1954, segregation is unconstitutional and illegal. But then 50, 60 years later, we look out and actually we don't have state-mandated segregation anymore, but we still have that in most places where there are a lot of minorities, kids go to de facto segregated schools. And so it is often the case that the Supreme Court may change the rules, but that a society that's still a little uncomfortable with this finds ways to evade the effects of that. And we have seen, like this recent vote in Houston, where there was this overwhelming rejection of an equal rights ordinance in a place that's pretty tolerant.
Right.
Houston is really different from most of Texas. But so how do you foresee the next few years?
There's still work to do, and when I say work to do, we still have plenty of organizing to do for our community, plenty of laws to pass. I think that marriage is safe. I think that the court ruling will stick. I don't think there's any serious interest in undoing it through constitutional amendment. But the conversation in a lot of states is just getting started. And we do have a huge challenge in that majority of states right now, you can be fired because you are gay or transgender. You can be kicked out of a place of business, public accommodation. You can be kept out of housing. And those are things that we need to fix. And that's the big, for me, that's the big unsolved challenge that is in front of our community.
When these specific equations come up, like an ordinance in a particular place, then people get very agitated, as they did in Houston, over questions about, well, if there are going to be equal rights for transgender people, does that mean that a born man is going to be going in a women's restroom, and those kinds of issues? And suddenly people get very shaky on some of the commitments.
It's really no different than the marriage fight, from my perspective. That our opponents, used the notion that young kids were going to learn about gay people marrying in their schools, and that was going to harm them or maybe turn them gay. And that was the pitch they used in California in 2008. In Houston, it's a really despicable attack that people are somehow going to pretend that they're transgender. Guys are going to take on the oppression of pretending they're transgender and then go hang out in women's rooms as ways to assault or take pictures of women or something. I mean, the conversation didn't get going to a deep enough extent for us to counter that narrative, but so there's still plenty of public education to do. But I think because it's so outrageous, as people get to know who transgender people are, that will fall by the wayside.
Yeah, I think to me it's just a kind of fascinating equation, because you are on those sorts of things. You're dealing with issues that for many people are really many decent people nonetheless have these reactions, are vulnerable to being to being triggered into these kinds of reactions, and it's always easier when your opponents are 100% bad. What's really complicated in politics is when the people on the other side are substantially good, even though they may really be wrong about the thing that you're right on.
Yeah, and that's certainly that was the case on marriage, and what you have to do, and I think this is also something we did a good job of, is respecting our opponents, respecting people who weren't with us entirely, because there are plenty of good people. All of us grew up in a society where we learned that marriage was between a man and a woman, and most of us grew up in a faith tradition where we learned that there was something wrong with homosexuality. So it's no surprise that good, honorable people were conflicted, and we had to address their conflict and walk them through it without saying, you're a bad person, you're a bigot, and because that shuts down the conversation. And guess what? When they go into the voting booth, they're not going to vote your way.
Yeah. It seems to me that redefining something like marriage is I think, as you were saying earlier, there are 1,001 specific benefits that associate with marriage in the past in terms of taxes and retirement and such. But also, marriage is a word that has a legal definition that is embedded in, gosh, there must be hundreds of thousands of statutes that make some reference to marriage in some manner, and that have embedded in many of those statutes a set of presumptions about gender roles, but that all are based on a male-female notion of marriage. Is that a big issue, though, or does that just solve itself?
Well, a couple thoughts. First, we would never describe, allowing same-sex couples to marry as redefining marriage. I don't think you define marriage by who you exclude from it. And marriage, and marriage laws have changed over the course of time from when it was a very male-centric, women-subservient institution to a much more equal institution. So, but what we find is that the laws generally cover, a family law for two people and two people who sometimes are raising children, and that hasn't really been a significant issue. Some states, like Massachusetts, hasn't changed its codes or anything. It's simply relying on the court ruling from more than a decade ago.
But there's also, to go back to Dr. King, the quote that's attributed to Dr. King, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This notion that ultimately there is something in the human spirit that is going to gradually find its way to the right place on these kinds of issues. But what do you say to that? At a time when we often get very frustrated with things that are happening in our country and what we feel like maybe are violations of our values in other dimensions of life, is this an example of where ultimately there's something about the American spirit or about the values of this country that did just simply pull toward justice over time?
I think they were pulled towards justice, and I think as you said, there are lots of other causes that people would say are not bending towards justice today. I think what the marriage movement was able to do was to present our common humanity to the American people, and I do think the American people are at root a just and people who want who believe in the golden rule number one, and believe in this notion of freedom and the right to be left alone. I mean, Dick Cheney, who was one of our strong supporters after his daughter came out, said freedom means freedom for everyone, and that notion is deeply embedded in the American ethic. So, but what we had to do is we had to explain who we were and talk about our families, and then walk Americans through a journey of and answer their honest, heartfelt questions.
What does this mean for you personally?
Well, it means I now can get married, I never really got into the fight. I mean, because out of a sense that, I need to get married. Although I was, I remember when I first got involved, I'd been in a bunch of weddings. I'd been groomsman in a bunch of weddings, and weddings were always like a bittersweet experience. I was so happy for my friends, and at the same time, I was, there was a little bit that felt sort of bitter that. That our society, our government, didn't give me this chance. But the thing that's so joyous now for me is as I think about the country, the entire country, and think about kids growing up in rural Virginia or rural Texas who might not grow up in a family that embraces gay people or a church, they see that their government, at least with respect to marriage, is treating gay people equally. And I think that sends a profound message to those kids. And that is, to me, that was always the number one driver, was creating a future for kids who discover that they're gay or lesbian, and having a better opportunities than people in my generation and before had.
Marc Solomon, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
The book is Winning Marriage, the inside story of how same-sex couples took on the politicians and pundits and won. We hope you'll join the conversation with American Forum on the Miller Center Facebook page, or by following us on Twitter @DouglasBlackman or @American Forum TV. To send us a comment about this program or download podcasts or transcripts, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next week.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.